Hello and welcome to the Taxcast from the Tax Justice Network. I'm Naomi Fowler. Coming up later, we look at the United States, Trump's tax reforms and the killing of the American dream.
As an American citizen and as a Kansan, I don't want to see everyone else in the country have to go through what Kansas just did. No one seems to have learned the lessons.
But first, here's a quick roundup of tax justice news this month. The family of murdered investigative journalist Daphne Caruana Galizia warned that her assassination in Malta last year set a new standard of criminality in the European Union by shutting down those who expose corruption. And I'm very sorry to report that in Slovakia, the journalist Jan Kuciak and his girlfriend were shot dead this month. He was specialised in reporting on fraud and tax evasion cases, often connected to politicians and particularly the party currently in power. Police suspect he was killed because of his work. In Malta, citizens there have been angered that the authorities removed billboards they put up demanding justice for Daphne Caruana Galizia. The group Occupy Justice said the government's zeal in enforcing planning laws on removable billboards contrasted with its eagerness to drown the country in cement and shadows. We're discussing Malta in a bit. There is some good news this month. Apple tried to get a ban through the courts on peaceful democratic protests at its stores in France against its outrageous tax-dodging practices by campaigners Attack France. The court threw it out. Here's John Christensen of the Tax Justice Network.
There's a disturbing trend towards stifling dissent in democratic countries. Big corporations are devoting huge legal budgets to attacking civil society protest. We should look at this as an important victory for peaceful and democratic protest.
Interesting how huge companies that contribute so little in taxes to countries they make so much money in are quite happy to use their legal systems taxpayers pay for. Attack France says they plan to continue their protests. No time for any more. Now we're going to talk to John Christensen of the Tax Justice Network for his take on this month. OK, John, so this month we've seen yet another terrible massacre in a school in the United States. This is apparently the 17th school shooting incident so far this year, according to the gun control group Everytown for Gun Safety. 17 students killed, a dozen of them wounded in Florida. The attitude to the right to bear arms and sell guns in the United States is inexplicable to people in many other countries. But there is a great power behind the gun lobby in the United States, and I guess that we shouldn't really be too surprised to learn that the NRA, the notorious National Rifle Association, is actually a tax-exempt non-profit organisation.
Well, that's right. The NRA is regarded as one of the most powerful political lobbies in the United States, which is actually registered as what's called a 501c3 tax-exempt organisation. That means that the NRA is able to raise millions. They claim their membership is somewhere in the region of 5 million, but they've raised millions of revenue every year. Since 2004, their revenue from membership fees is in the order of about 130 million US dollars. They raise millions every year, in their words, to fund gun safety and educational profits of benefit to the general public. So they're claiming that they have an educational public role. Its members lobby leaders in Congress. They write extensively to the press and the media in the United States. They're very active on social media. They use their votes to promote tax rights. And they are largely successful in protecting the interests of the gun industry and the firearms enthusiasts in the United States. And that raises questions about whether or not it's appropriate for this tax-exempt status to be granted to a body which seems to have, above all, political rather than educational purposes.
Right, and the interesting thing is they're not very clear on their number of members and what sort of revenue they get. They are also not clear on the donations they get either, I believe, not very transparent generally. And also, they're apparently under FBI investigation at the moment as to whether a Russian banker funneled money through them to help the candidate at the time for presidency, Donald Trump.
Yeah, it's peculiar that an organisation that has 501 status, in other words, is treated as a tax-exempt charitable organisation, is so weak on its transparency. As you say, we don't know how many members they have. You'd have thought that would be something they'd put up on their website and amend every single year to update it.
Right, and the criticism is that it's not so much an organisation for gun owners anymore, but more of an organisation for gun manufacturers and their interests. Anyway, let's talk about Malta. We've been covering on the Taxcast the murder of investigative journalist Daphne Caruana Galizia there, who worked on the Panama Papers, and she exposed all sorts of corruption in Malta. And Malta's been ringing a lot of alarm bells for many years now as a kind of a pirate state in the European Union, a captured state. It's a favourite mafia location for money laundering. And concerns have been raised by members of the European Parliament about state capture. Her family has no faith in the investigation into the car bomb that killed Daphne Caruana Galizia because they say there are so many conflicts of interest operating there. And now it turns out that questions are being asked about potentially inadequate supervision in Malta of Pilatus Bank. This bank being the same one that Daphne Caruana Galizia was accusing of money laundering and of having high-level clients known as politically exposed persons from places like Azerbaijan and Angola. Pilatus Bank was suing Daphne Caruana Galizia over her accusations, a case that it dropped after her death. I mean, we don't know if there's a connection, of course, but what we do see in Malta is things like the removal of billboards earlier this month asking who killed Daphne Caruana Galizia, some apparently official attempts in Malta to close down debate about the murder and about corruption generally.
Yeah, so it's now over 4 months since Malta's highest profile investigating journalist was blown up in a car bomb attack. Now, the bank at the centre of the investigation by the European Banking Authority, the Pilatus Bank, which you mentioned, has its headquarters located in a tiny little town called Tashbiesh in central Malta, with a population of 1,804 people. Pilatus Bank describes itself as a provider of private and commercial banking services to premier, affluent and high net wealth individuals and their commercial enterprises. The bank appears to be largely engaged in providing offshore wealth management services, and not so much the traditional banking activity in Malta, and appears largely to be what you might call a relationship manager with ultra-wealthy clients using offshore financial secrecy jurisdictions. And of course, Malta is a financial secrecy jurisdiction. It was ranked 20th on Tax Justice Network's own Financial Secrecy Index ranking, published in January this year. Now, perhaps not coincidentally, Daphne Caruana Galizia reported in the aftermath of the Panama Papers leaks that Pilatus Bank was providing banking services to family members of Azerbaijan's president, Ilham Aliyev, and another Azerbaijani government minister. So why has the European Banking Authority chosen to intervene at this stage? According to the EBA, it was requested by the European Commission to establish whether the Maltese Financial Services Authority was capable of properly undertaking its supervisory duties, and further, whether in view of the lack of action taken against Pilatus Bank, the Maltese authority was able to act without political interference coming from within Malta. The European Banking Authority has also been requested to investigate whether the fact that Pilatus Bank continues to hold a European banking licence, which allows it to provide banking services within the European Union single market, warrants intervention by the European Central Bank. So this investigation is headed to the very highest level. Now, not surprisingly, the European Banking Authority intervention has triggered a furious backlash from some Maltese politicians, some Maltese journalists, but it's also worth considering the words of Andrew Caruana Galizia, who's the son of Daphne, the murdered journalist. On the 25th of February this month, in other words, Andrew tweeted, "If our best-known journalist can be killed in broad daylight, nothing and no one is safe." In this dangerous context, no amount of external pressure is too much, and no amount of protest is exaggerated. It could save lives, and it might deliver justice. So there's clearly a very divided island. On the one hand, state capture, including journalist capture, and on the other hand, a civil society protest against the murder of their most prominent journalist. Journalists and civil society are being threatened by clearly very powerful players within Malta.
John Christensen of the Tax Justice Network. Now it's time for the Taxcast special feature. Last month's new Financial Secrecy Index results put the United States in second place on our Tax Justice Network roll of dishonour. And that's not only bad news for citizens in other countries because the United States is eroding their tax base and facilitating criminality, it's hurting US citizens too. Because a political leadership that's okay with money laundering and tax cheating comes from the same mentality that's killing the American dream and turning it into the American nightmare. This month, the Taxcast looks at President Trump's tax reforms and human rights in the country.
Hasn't been done in 34 years, but actually really hasn't been done because we broke every record. It's the largest, I always say the most massive, but it's the largest tax cut in the history of our country. And reform, but tax cut. Really something special.
At the end of 2017, President Trump got through his tax reform bill and signed it into law. The bill was rushed through, and you can get a bit of a taste of the frustration about that from an angry Senator Elizabeth Warren here.
So here it is Friday night, and I just want to give you an idea of how the Republican leadership thinks we're supposed to make laws in the United States Senate. They have just released the tax bill. It is about 500 pages, and they want us to vote on this thing in about an hour. An hour. I spent more than an hour making a decision about the refrigerator that we recently bought. But the Republicans think that they can cram through a tax bill that will affect every family in America, that will touch every business in America, and they can do it by just jamming through a bunch of paper and telling everybody to go vote on it.
As others have said, this is not a tax reform, it's a tax deform.
Nicholas Luciani of the Centre for Economic and Social Rights.
The U.S. can only be called a laughingstock amongst democracies after this tax bill process. It was rushed through in the middle of the night. There were no real hearings or public debate. It was thoroughly undemocratic. And the results have been really terrible. I'm sure in the coming years there will be a reckoning.
I'm sure there will, because just as the gaps between rich and poor on every measure are going through the roof, the Trump administration's tax reforms look set to make a bad situation even worse. They've dropped the official corporate tax rate from 35% to 21%, an amount few, if any, multinationals are actually paying anyway. We know that US companies already pay an average of 14%, and of course the really, really big ones pay much less than that, and some pay no federal income tax at all. So you get this bizarre result where low-income workers are paying proportionately more in tax than these huge multinational corporations. Trump's provided various tax cuts for high earners, some small cuts for middle earners that disappear in stages over time. Companies like Apple got what multinationals have been lobbying for years, to repatriate profits they've been hoarding offshore at a massively reduced rate. Something's got to give. Someone's got to pay for these cuts, right, Nicholas?
Absolutely. There are more than 45 million people living in the U.S. in poverty. That's 1 in 7 Americans in a country that's the richest in history. Inequality is growing. Intergenerational mobility is growing. We have very wide racial disparities in everything from education to healthcare to housing to wages, and in wealth inequalities between racial groups are huge and growing. There are acute gender disparities in all of these areas as well. And the so-called recovery since the recession has been the most lopsided in U.S. history, with something like 95% of the gains going to the top 1%. The Trump tax bill is deepening these. As we know, it's giving 80% of the tax benefits to the richest 1%. So extraordinary shift of income and wealth from the low and middle income households to the rich. And how will all this be paid for? We know that it's going to create a $1.5 trillion debt over 10 years. This is a perfect kind of textbook pretext for creating backdoor cuts to essential programs to reduce inequality and lift poverty.
Right, and the levels of poverty and deprivation in the United States are so bad they're now provoking strong criticism. United Nations Rapporteur on Poverty and Human Rights, Professor Philip Alston, has just completed an investigative mission there.
$2 a day in the rest of the world, which is the accepted international poverty line, or almost, it's actually $1.90 a day according to the World Bank. That would reasonably be translated to something like $4 a day in the United States. And if one used that as a benchmark, there would be more than 5 million Americans who are living in absolute poverty that would be below international standards. In other words, the sort of standards that we think are highly problematic in developing countries like India or Nepal or wherever. You've got more than 5 million Americans living at that level. So it means that people have virtually no cash to spend. They are dependent on what they can eke out from family and friends, from very inadequate government benefits, which in any event these days give them increasingly little cash. So they rely on food stamps, which they can only use to buy certain types of food and so on. A lot of people who are living at the poverty line can't get government-funded health coverage, health care. I think these people are living an extremely precarious life. If a tooth falls out or a shoe is lost or a child has an accident, there's no money at all to pay for that. And I think that's the sort of existence that probably some 20 million Americans are experiencing.
You talk about the betrayal of the American dream and its replacement with the American illusion. What do you mean by that?
Well, the American dream essentially is built on this notion of a very high degree of mobility within the society, so that people who are born in very poor socioeconomic circumstances can nonetheless rise to the very top of the society. And this was for a very long time, and still is, in fact, in common parlance, the way in which Americans think of their society. The reality, though, is that statistics show that the United States actually has less social mobility than any of the other developed countries. And in fact, increasingly, one can predict based on the zip code where someone is born and lives what their life chances are, meaning that if you're born in a zip code or a suburb which is very poor, you're highly unlikely to change your circumstances significantly. And vice versa, that if you're born in a rich zip code, your chances of making it are very high.
And in terms of making a bad situation even worse, one thing that really stands out as a result of President Trump's tax reforms are that an estimated 13 million people could lose health insurance, and that could result in 10,000 avoidable deaths. Some are hoping it'll all be worth it in the end because of the boost to the economy it's going to bring, the jobs are going to come rolling in, and it's all going to be great. But citizens in Kansas are watching all this in horror.
As an American citizen, and as a Kansan, I don't want to see everyone else in the country have to go through what Kansas just did. As a Kansan, that is really what gets under my skin, is that no one seems to have learned the lessons.
This is Rachel Cross, policy analyst at Frontier Group, a think tank research and public policy centre. A strikingly similar tax reform was carried out by their governor, Sam Brownback, back in 2012. They're still digging themselves out of it. Even fellow Republicans are repealing it.
Mr. Speaker, the Governor of the state of Kansas.
Please admit the Honorable Sam Brownback, Governor of the state of Kansas.
Kansans rue the day when Governor Brownback took up the reins in their state. He cut taxes across the board with a 0% income tax rate for some companies. It was supposed to be a shot of adrenaline into the heart of the Kansas economy. It was all going to be great. But his economic revolution just didn't happen. Tax revenues dried up, the state used up all the money in the piggy bank, and then the really serious cuts started. Tell us about that.
So the biggest result of the tax plan was some serious revenue deficiencies, and a lot of really short-term decisions came from our public officials about how to plug these budget holes that were caused by the tax plan. And it culminated with severe cuts to the public education budget. And in fact, the cuts to that education budget got so bad that the state Supreme Court two times ruled that the underfunding of the public school system was unconstitutional. For instance, my childhood school district cut 3 weeks from the beginning of the school year to save on August air conditioning costs. It breaks my heart because who's really going to have to pay the consequences of this? It's going to be our children.
How did parents cope with the 3 extra weeks of childcare when they've got to go to work?
Well, that's certainly a part of the problem, is that this ended up extending that summer vacation, which already can be really difficult for parents to have to find, either other family members to watch their children or to, go to summer programs, which also experienced budget cuts as well, or to have to find private daycares that just are expensive and hard for parents to do. And already you have 3 months of the summer that you have to fill, and then you have almost a whole nother month tacked on there at the end. A lot of the short-sighted decisions that started coming to plug these budget holes started with selling off state assets for far less than we had invested in them initially. But really it started to affect people when it got down to, delayed payments to the pension fund and cutting spending on basically every program under the sun in Kansas. Schools, they were really struggling to find teachers to fill positions. Hospitals were struggling. Even the state prisons and highway patrols were struggling to hire because of these budget cuts. But then it got down to issues of public health, that the cuts impacted the state's Medicaid program to the point that the state ended up with the longest Medicaid application backlog that it had had in its state history.
And the tax exemptions for businesses in Kansas, what they called the pass-through exemption, they worry you a lot, don't they?
Yeah, there are some structural similarities between the Kansas tax plan and what is now the national tax plan. The pass-through exemption being the really big one that's going to cut taxes essentially for businesses. In Kansas, that pass-through exemption was particularly problematic because they had an estimate of how many businesses were going to be able to qualify for that tax cut. Their operating philosophy was that these tax conditions are so great, more small businesses are going to open in our state. And that's not what happened. What happened was more businesses just started to restructure in order to qualify for that tax cut. And I would be astonished if we don't see a similar situation start to develop on the national stage. It's been really painful to watch, and it's painful to think that Kansas, my home state, has spent these last 5 years or so as this laboratory for supply-side tax policy, and Congress chose to ignore the results of their own test. It just says to me that these people of Kansas are going to have suffered for really nothing if we didn't even learn a lesson from it.
How long is it going to take for Kansas, do you think, to recover and get out of this mess?
That's a great question. Brownback, believe it or not, left just very recently to become an ambassador for the United States, which is, a whole other level of horrifying. I don't think anyone really knows how long it's going to take to fix the mess that's been created in Kansas. And that's really, bottom line, the problem with poorly designed tax policy that isn't responsive to the needs of the people that are living under it. We created such devastating budget holes and made such short-sighted decisions, like all those cuts to social welfare programs and to our education system, that those long-term impacts are going to stay around long after that tax bill has actually been repealed. Currently, last summer, something kind of incredible happened in that the moderate conservatives in the Kansas legislature actually got together and overrode Governor Brownback's veto of their repeal of his tax plan, which was a really astonishing political moment that, it was clear Kansans have had enough. But the problem is those legislators inherited a huge mess. Right now, they're considering raising, income taxes, especially on businesses again, which is a great first step, but it's not going to be enough to undo that damage.
So, as I say, in Kansas, even members of the same political party aren't buying their own party's tax reforms. Here's Nicholas Luciani again.
The whole process has undermined public trust, not only in the party in power, but also in the federal tax system as such. And it's exactly when we need to rebuild that trust for some pretty significant collective endeavors, such as fighting climate change, fighting inequality, wresting power back from an economic elite.
But you think you're seeing a change in awareness in the United States about tax?
Absolutely. People are starting to come onto this. That's one of the upsides or the silver linings of this very regressive tax reform is now people all over the country are talking about tax as an issue of justice. This is new in the U.S. over the past 10 years, but now they've realized that their health, their education, their social protection, their very lives are at stake when tax bills are being debated in Congress, and people are out there using every means necessary to replace this tax bill with something more just. We're really living in a moment that's eerily similar to the Roaring '20s and the first Gilded Age in the U.S., where you had politicians putting through very regressive tax reforms, using their economic and political power to capture the public policy process, and then creating massive economic downturns in doing so. And the response then, as I think is the response now, is that people are standing up and they're not going to take it anymore. The irony is that this Trump-Ryan tax plan was put into law in the midst of a real growing groundswell of support across the United States for higher education as a human right. That's relatively new in the U.S. There's a growing groundswell here for healthcare and childcare and elder care as human rights, for affordable housing and a healthy environment as human rights, clean water, women's rights and racial justice as human rights, and a growing need and respect for the ability to vote and the ability to participate in decisions which affect your family's finances as a human right. There's really a blowback coming right now, and I see it across the country, that this tax overreach by Trump and his party are really helping to propel a really vivacious movement. Not only just repeal this tax bill, but replace it with a new public financing system and set of rules which values people over profits, and which may just include, in some ways, a new economic bill of rights, which are similar to those which were proposed by President Roosevelt back in 1944.
Well, that's good to hear about the silver lining to the cloud. It's a political argument that needs to be had and won primarily, but it's also interesting, isn't it, that the United States currently has an administration which is increasingly contemptuous about the rule of law and social rights. And, the United States never signed up to the United Nations International Covenant on Economic, Cultural and Social Rights, which almost every other developed nation has done. It makes you wonder, other than the political arguments and the debates that need to happen, how far can the rule of law help the country?
Yeah, you're right that the strictly legal avenues to challenge this tax bill are largely closed at the international level. But if you look internally, it's very interesting to see right now there are a lot of states, attorney generals of different states in the subnational level here in the U.S. that are talking about pursuing legal challenges to this tax bill. So the human rights legal challenges are coming from the least expected places.
Oh, that's really interesting. What are the other states involved in this?
So right now, direct legal challenges to the Trump-Ryan tax bill have been discussed in New York, New Jersey, California, and each of those states and others are worried that certain provisions in the federal tax changes will limit their space within their own state to support their state constitution and to invest progressively in social programs. In California in particular, there's a lot of discussion around the huge budget cuts that will be inevitable from this tax bill, in particular hitting healthcare. California benefited a lot from the Affordable Care Act under the previous administration, and a lot of those funds will likely go away. So that's going to pull the rug under a long time legacy and struggle in California to create a universal healthcare system.
The United Nations Rapporteur on Poverty and Human Rights, Professor Philip Alston, has completed his mission to the United States, and he's going to present his final report to the UN Human Rights Council in June 2018.
There's no doubt in my mind that tax policy is human rights policy in so many different ways. What's in any country's fiscal policy determines what sort of resources are going to be available for human rights of all types. I guess with the recent American tax cuts, you're going to see much greater inequality combined with even further reductions in the social safety net available to the poorest. What's got to happen in the US is a change in the mentality. I would argue that there should ideally be some sort of recognition of what we call social rights. In other words, the right to healthcare, for example. The other option is to draw attention to the precariousness of American democracy. The poor are increasingly excluded from the electoral process through lots of different mechanisms, and the political process is functioning increasingly just to appeal to the wealthy. That is contrary to all of the assumptions, I would say, that are in the US Constitution and that Americans hold dear.
I'll leave you with this thought. The wealthy have benefited decade after decade from falling taxes and offshore shelters. But let's look at what's happened to corporate taxation in the United States. Back in 1945, they accounted for 35% of federal government revenues. In 2018, White House estimates put that at 6.5%. How much lower will voters allow them to go? How much lower will we allow our governments to go? We'll be back next month.